everybody. My name is Gray from the 8-Bit Garden System. If you don't know me, I am a co-host here on 47 and Counting, along with my system partner Valentine, and I have here a good friend of mine who is also a system, and we're just going to be doing a little interview. Would you like to introduce yourself? You can do it by collective, by whoever's fronting, anything you want to do.
Okay, so we are the Guardian Collective. My personal name is Mari. I'm a host of the system, and I am around like 16 years old, 17 years old, around that age. And yeah.
Awesome. Okay. And how are you doing today, Mari? Where are you in your healing journey?
I'm doing pretty all right today. I would say that on my personal healing journey, I think I'm pretty far along. I'm a fusion between two altars. The old altars' names are Max and Lucy, and we fully integrated, I would say, probably in around May of last year, so May 2023. And that was a really great healing experience for me personally. I love being a fusion between the two altars. I still feel them both present within me, like as almost as if they're equals, if that makes sense. And I love the both of them so much because they are a part of me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's actually so comforting to hear as we as a system, we're pretty sure we're polyfragmented. We split all the time, and we want to look into fusing altars. I asked you a little bit earlier, a while ago, about our two altars, Waylon and Remy, trying to fuse, and it is just so comforting to hear that, like, it's been good for you and that you enjoy it, and that's so cool.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad that it's comforting for you to hear because I feel like sometimes as a community, we really shy away from the discussion of integration and fusion, but it can be so helpful and so healing for a system.
Yeah, definitely. We want to integrate not too much, but as much as what would be good for us. We try to focus on doing it intentionally, but we haven't had a lot of luck yet. But we know that it is a slow process for the most part.
Yes, yeah. It took Max and Lucy, like I would say like a year and a half in order to get to that point of integration. So it definitely it does take a long time, and it takes a lot of communication, a lot of like breaking down of those walls.
Okay, that's really good to know. I will make sure Remy and Waylon know that because they are definitely first on our agenda.
That's good.
All right, so I forgot to say this before we got started. This goes without saying. I think I've told you it already, but just to be sure, any question I ask, if you're not comfortable answering it, if you don't want to, if there's any reason at all, you don't even have to have a reason. Just say, I would rather not answer that, and we're good. We'll move on.
Thank you.
All right, so if you're comfortable, walk me through a day in your life, like maybe symptoms. What symptoms do you feel like you're battling with, if you're comfortable talking about it? And are there any symptoms that you feel like you have like a better grasp on?
Okay, so kind of doing a little bit of a walk through my day. I usually wake up extremely panicked because I have chronic nightmares. I have nightmares every single night. They're very drastic and very scary to all of us. Even no matter the altar that is dreaming, it always seems to be catered to the altar who is dreaming, if that makes sense. So we always wake up extremely panicked and extremely just anxiety ridden. So that's kind of how I start my day every single day. And then that brings us immediately into dissociation and derealization and depersonalization. So I kind of immediately deal with those heavy symptoms when I wake up. And I would say that the symptoms that's actually easier for me to deal with is the anxiety and the panic aspect of it, because I can treat that with my medication. But it's the derealization, it's the depersonalization, the dissociation that I have to deal with constantly, that I have to learn specific grounding techniques for, and I'm not always able to use those grounding techniques while I'm dissociating.
Yeah.
So it's really hard. And I don't know if I have a steady grasp on it quite yet. So those are the symptoms that I find the easiest to deal with in the mornings, and then the symptoms I find with the hardest that kind of go through that the entire day because I start my day so stressed out.
Yeah, that sounds really difficult. For us, the mornings are usually very dissociative, but Most of our symptoms that we handle in the mornings are related to more of like the BPD and the trauma. So I cannot, like, we used to have kind of consistent nightmares, but nothing like that. So I can't imagine what it's like to just start your day like that.
I would say I'm working through it through medication aspect of it, through the medication aspect of it, and through the therapy aspect of it. I do believe that my nightmares are all trauma related, whether I remember them fully or don't remember them fully. The more related to trauma they are, actually the less likely that I'm able to remember them, because our memories are just so, I don't want to say misconstrued, but just so foggy that the closer it is to trauma, the less likely it is that we would remember it. But the more abstract and more strange it is, the more likely we will be able to remember it.
Interesting. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, let me see. Oh, I did want to ask. I saw one of your altar roll calls. I believe their name is Phoebe. What pronouns do they use?
They use she, her pronouns. So she uses she, her pronouns.
She, her. I had a question. I saw that Phoebe said that she tries to front in the mornings due to the nightmares and to help you start off on a more positive note. Do you think that has been helping, / do you think that you are at a point or working towards a point where she's able to front in that way?
I would say yes. It's so helpful when she's able to front in the mornings and just kind of get our day going. She's so positive and such a mood booster for us that it's just so nice for her to be there for us in the mornings. We can't quite get her to front consistently, but sometimes when it does work, it works really well. We are less dissociated. She's able to perform her daily tasks. We feel more ready for the day. We're not as tired or anything like that. Like, she is basically like a miracle worker for us in the mornings. It really like sets our days like on a completely different route if she fronts during the morning.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. It is definitely like a different kind of day when you start off with a mood booster. At least for me, it lasts at least a little bit. If not, it affects the rest of the day.
I definitely think that mood boosters and apparently normal parts in a system are super important in keeping the balance of a system, if that makes sense. And without those parts, it kind of becomes so unbalanced and so uneasy that it doesn't really work properly.
Yeah, I don't know what we would do without our mood boosters, our confidence holders. Like, we need, like, as a collective, we need that time to feel confident and to have, like, endorphins running through our system. So I think that is so important and such a valued role. I think every altar has a valued role for the most part, but
Of course.
I just think that is really cool.
Yeah.
All right, so next question. And again, if you don't want to talk about that, that's okay. But are there any symptoms that you feel like overlap between the NPD or potential NPD, whichever you want to call it, and DID that really affect you day to day? And how specifically do they affect you, whether you want to say the specific symptoms or not?
So our potential NPD and DID do kind of go together. It kind of, I want to say, the grandiosity of some of the altars that we have, and feeling non-human and feeling pretty connected to certain aspects of religion and feeling like a higher power or almost better than other people, definitely ties into our DID and with some altars. I was actually talking to my therapist today about Angel, which is a seraphim in our system, who is very still connected to religion, even though it has traumatized us and that kind of stuff, and definitely believes that she is that higher power and that she is morally superior and that she can help other people because she is morally superior than other people. And how that really drains us throughout the entire day, because she will just constantly be like, do you need help with anything? I can help you with that. Like, I can definitely do that, because that's how she finds her worth and that's how she fuels her ego. So it was it's interesting that you bring it up, because that's just how those symptoms overlap. it's very interesting that it shows with specific alters in their non-human behaviors or their beliefs about themselves being non-human. And then for our other alters, like our alter calm, that's very much shown in their lack of care for other people. They're very self-centered, very grandiose, and that kind of stuff. So it's very spread out amongst the alters, but certain alters hold more symptoms than others, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yes, we definitely have some alters who are more symptomatic than others, and some alters who hold specific disorders, and some who just don't. So I can definitely understand that.
It's very interesting to see those kind of disorders play out. Like, we are autistic as well, and it's very interesting how the special interests vary from alter to alter, how which symptoms do they hold more so than the others, especially with our OCD as well, the different obsessions that we have or the different compulsions that we have for each alter. It's just very interesting how disorders in a system can be vastly different just depending on the personality or the part that's fronting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's really interesting and so important to analyze, because the more you understand it, the more you can treat it and see what's going on.
Exactly.
So going back to Angel a little bit, I had two things I found interesting. One, that definitely sounds exhausting for all parties involved, including Angel. It just sounds exhausting, and I am very proud of any effort anyone has put into to balance that out. Because while it's great that, Angel wants to be like a good person and believes they are a good person, I can definitely understand the exhaustion.
Oh yeah, it's very exhausting on the system in general. My therapist put it as like she's almost her efforts to be more helpful, to be the nicest, to just show how morally superior she is to other people, is really hurting and draining other alters in the system. And that realization really hit her hard, because she doesn't want to hurt the system or herself, because she loves everybody in the system so much, but her actions are hurting the system even if they are making her feel better and more worthy.
Right, and that's so hard to come to terms with, so I'm just very proud of her. I see a lot of similarities between your Angel and my Stephanie. Just like over the course of us talking, I've noticed so many similarities, and they're definitely not exactly the same, but I know Stephanie deals with the feeling like, and correct me if I put this in a wrong way, but feeling like if you're not helping people, then you're not worthy.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's how my therapist definitely put it, and I definitely agree with my therapist on that.
Yeah, that's very difficult.
Yeah, it's very in terms of Angel's, it goes along with Angel's superiority complex, or her almost savior complex as well. Angel is very geared towards saving humans, as she always puts it. She wants them to make sure they're safe. She wants them to have a good life, a happy life. And if she's unable to basically save another person from their struggles or their woes, it puts her in a crash almost immediately, because it's just, so I'm not perfect, so I'm not morally superior, so I'm not the nicest, so I can't do that. And it really burns her ego out almost to zero, or even below zero. And she is proven, in quotation marks, proven that she is not morally superior, or she is not that higher power or that higher being.
Right. Okay, let's see. Would you be able to describe what your particular narcissistic high feels like, and maybe what behaviors this might encourage?
So for us, for me personally, like me, Mari, they feel like I have so much energy, and I just need to tell somebody how great and how much better I am than they are. It can come off as me like showing off my art and being like, oh my gosh, look at this, I just drew this, it's so wonderful and amazing, or even fishing for compliments, if that makes sense. just showing how like great I am and how basically just it's like my ego is just constantly being fueled, and it's just over to the like over that 100 point, like maybe at 110 or 120. It almost feels like a mania. I've been manic before, just because I do have some bipolar symptoms, but it's different than a mania in the sense that I'm not super awake for a long period of time. It's more so I'm fueling my ego myself, and I'm fueling basically the fire, and that energy has to go somewhere. And so I often will text my friends, just be like, I'm so amazing. I just really am like so full of myself, and I just love myself so much, because I honestly do believe that I am one of the best people to be around.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
it does. Yeah, and that also sounds exhausting. Like, I can understand why it might, if you would put it this way, it might feel good occasionally, or as much as it does, but I can definitely see how something that intense might be tiring. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, and I also always worry about the state I'm going to be in afterwards, if that makes sense, because it's such a high, and it's such like I'm so full of myself. My ego is so full that when it comes down, I'm like, wait, why don't I feel like this anymore? Why do I not feel like I'm on top of the world? And then the cycle repeats itself, where I need a better supply, I need more of a supply, and if I don't get that supply, then I can turn really quickly into a crash. And I don't want a crash to happen, because that makes us feel so down and so in the dumps, in such a deep despair, that I feel like a lot of people with personality disorders can agree that when they're in that down state, it's not just the depression, it's not just the anxiety, it's not just a deep dark feeling, it's like a sense of absolute despair, and like there's a hole inside of you, if that makes sense.
Yes, I can definitely relate to that. I have bipolar 1 and the BPD, and that perfectly describes both the manic versus depressive, because for those who might not know, usually if you have a manic episode, you have a depressive episode following the crash. And I found it very similar with BPD, just in a different way. With bipolar, it's more gradual and cyclical, and BPD is more kind of like a light switch, as I tend to say. But it still has that like high and then a crash, and I think you described that pretty on par. That's pretty much what it feels like. It's like indescribable how bad the crash can be.
Absolutely. Like in those crash moments, it's I feel a narc crash when my ego, or something that I believe to be true about myself, like that I am better, that I am the best, and that I am, specifically for all of us, like morally superior, just better than everybody else. When that's proven to not be true, or if someone like challenges that ideal, it can send me straight down, and my ego and my self-esteem almost at the same time crashes, and I have to rebuild myself back up. But in those moments of a narc crash, I feel extremely like trigger warning for suicide, just the word suicide. Just I feel super suicidal. I feel like my worth is just I have no worth, so why on earth am I still living here anymore? Why am I trying so hard, and that kind of stuff. It really, I don't think people realize how far a narc crash can go, and how damaging it is to purposefully try to trigger a narc crash in people, which I often see those articles often say how to defeat a narcissist, how to start like a narc crash so they don't get any more supply. And I'm just like, but it's not, a true narcissist needs their supply in order to keep feeling good about themselves. And a true narcissist, when they are in a crash, it is awful, and it's an awful feeling. Many people who have NPD, I have a friend who has NPD, think about self-harm, thinking about offing themselves and that kind of stuff. It's not a good thing to try and trigger for a true actual person who's diagnosed with NPD, or a true narcissist. Now, I see the term narcissist often thrown around way too much in our society today. Like a person who it's almost been considered to be synonymous with someone who's emotionally manipulative or emotionally abusive or abusive in any way, and that is just not true. I wanted to address this, especially since I'm talking about my NPD symptoms, that I am not inherently abusive because of my NPD symptoms. It is a trauma response. It is a defense mechanism, just like any personality disorder is, especially the cluster B personality disorders. Trauma has to happen for those personality disorders to trigger. And so I often see that people are calling narcissists abusers when really narcissists have been through abuse. So it's just, I feel like it's not something that is talked about enough within our community, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Or in the mental health community as a whole, because people are still actively using narcissistic abuse or narcissistic manipulation. I've even heard used. There's a whole like therapy for narcissistic abuse. Like, I don't see that as helpful in diminishing the stigma of having NPD.
And I have so much to say. Let me see if I can remember it all. Something that I think is very important about the whole narcissistic abuse, like, group or whatever it is every abuse case, every single one is different. And while I'm not saying group therapy isn't helpful, what I'm saying is, even if narcissistic abuse was like a thing that was okay to say, which it's not, it just wouldn't make sense, in my opinion, because it seems like people who say narcissistic abuse is like trying to group abuse, but I don't think abuse can really be grouped other than just saying abuse.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I can see that there's different types of abuse. Like, there's physical abuse, there's emotional abuse, like, there's different really big terms for them. But there's not the specific terms, if that makes sense.
Right.
Like, there's not just one way a person can be physically abused. There's not just one way a person could be emotionally abused. And if there was, they wouldn't use disorders as a term for it. Because a lot of people who have these disorders are just normal people. They just function a bit differently than the regular, of course, in quotation marks, population.
Right. And I do want to say, while I do think, I want to make this clear, I think wholeheartedly people should just take your word for it when you say, just because I have NPD doesn't mean I'm abusive. I also want to say, as your friend, I've heard you say things, and if you want me to cut this out, then that's okay, but I've heard you say things like, oh, was this specific alter mean to you? And I've never experienced any of your alters being mean, and I'm not saying it's never going to happen, because there's going to be a time I'm mean to you by accident, there's going to be a time you're mean to me, and we're just going to have to work through it, but I have never experienced any kind of abuse or manipulation from you, and I think it's just so evil, that was another thing I wanted to say. It's so evil to think to trigger like a narc crash, and so selfish. It's so selfish.
Yeah, it really is. Like, I've had a lot of friends saying, like, do you want me to stop giving you a supply? Do you want me to limit your supply? Like, what do you want me to do? I'm like, just be normal. Like, give a supply. Like, I often get supply just from like helping other people, or from people telling me how great I am and that kind of stuff, to be a good friend and that kind of stuff. It's just be your normal self. And I'm not going to say that giving me too much of a supply is healthy, but not taking away my supply, because that's going to be extremely unhealthy for me as well. Kind of an equal balance, or understanding that you can give supply freely and I can give you a supply back. Like, I often say, a lot of my friends have BPD, autism, and a bunch of other neurodivergencies, that I often just get a supply from being around people who I deem to be equal to me, and that kind of stuff, or in other things like that. So I just think that it's not a matter of like you have to take away their supply or you have to stop them in this way because my narcissism isn't going to go away.
Exactly.
That's just it's just like with borderline personality disorder, just like with antisocial personality disorder. They're personality disorders.
Right.
They're not going to go away just because you make a behavioral change.
Right. I feel like someone purposefully triggering a narc crash for you would be like, I don't even know. It's just so unnecessary. And, like, I guess if you are the most uneducated on NPD in the world, I can see why you might think for a second maybe this would quote-unquote help. But I still think it's selfish. I still think you're not thinking things through. And I think at the very end of the day, like, say it was me who thought that would be helpful. I would ask you first.
Like all my friends asked me like, hey, like, if you're in a narc high, do you want me to like to take you down by giving you a crash? I'm like, no. Like they asked me, of course, beforehand because of course they have their own biases about NPD and that kind of stuff, but they're trying to work through them. So it's way better to ask.
Oh yeah.
To just assume that this is what you're supposed to do when encountering a narcissist. So. And I also wanted to say that this is like very similar if you want to use like more borderline personality disorder traits. This is very similar to like triggering a split.
Yes.
Borderline personality disorder. Like you don't want to purposefully trigger a split. You don't want to purposefully make them feel like they're being abandoned because that's an awful feeling for a person with borderline personality disorder. I can't say that I can relate to that feeling of feeling abandoned, but from what I've been told from other people with borderline personality disorder, that it feels like the end of the world to them and just puts them in such a deep, dark place. And I wouldn't want that for anybody, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a great comparison because it's obviously not one-to-one, but in severity, like, why would anyone do that? It's awful. I can't believe there are people, like, anyway.
Yeah, I know, right?
All right, so what does switching, like DID switching, feel like for you? And does it vary, like, between alter to alter or just in any other factors?
Oh, it feels like an overwhelming, like, dizziness. Like, I almost just fall over because for some alters, like, if the switch just doesn't happen as smoothly, it just doesn't seem to work. Or these two alters don't really have a connection to each other in the inner world. It's just, I feel so dizzy, I feel so lightheaded, my vision gets a little blurry sometimes. That's for alters that are like extremely unconnected and that kind of stuff, or even just a little bit unconnected to me. But if I switch between like an alter who's in my system family, which my system family includes Calm, Angel, Joy, and Sophie, those switches happen almost immediately without any issues at all, and I sometimes can barely even notice it because in the inner world I live with them, so I'm constantly near them. I feel more comfortable communicating with them. So I often think that our switches, depending on the severity of switch, it really depends on whether or not I'm able to communicate with them or I'm near them in the inner world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I want to keep an eye on our own switches because I've definitely noticed it varies, but I can't pick out the pattern, which I'm not great at patterns. But I think it's interesting that it could have to do with how easily you can communicate with them, because that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I think for us at least, it's dependent on the communication because we have several subsystems as well. And when we have an alter switch from the main system, which was what we call it, to one of the subsystems, it's like we get a headache. The memory loss is just completely like almost as if I just woke up there. Like if I switch from Raven, who is like the host of one of our subsystems, to me, Mari, the host of the main system, almost nothing connects at all. And we've been trying to work on the communication aspect so the switches aren't as severe, but it's honestly extremely hard to even bridge those gaps, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. Is there any way, a specific alter is fronting? For example, for us, music and style are two very important things to us. So, for example, if we're drawn to, like, a certain aesthetic or, like, an outfit or a genre of music, that's very telling who's fronting.
I totally get what you're saying, because for us, it's always handwriting. Our handwriting is extremely different based on the altar. I don't know why it's extremely different based on, like, the altar, but let's just say, I'll give you an example. Angel's handwriting is extremely, very pretty cursive and very messy cursive, but Calm's handwriting is all caps, very small, and not in cursive at all. It's like in a font type. It's like in a Roman Times numeral font, basically. It's very different. It's very different. So whenever we're unsure of who's fronting, or if we feel blurry or just not all together, or not grounding properly, we always reach out for our journal and just say hello. And so there's several entries in our journal that just says hello, 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 and it's just so we know, like, based on handwriting, because we can go back on it and look at it later and be like, oh yeah, that's Mari's handwriting, oh yeah, that's Calm's handwriting, oh yeah, that's Angel's handwriting. And so it's very interesting the way that we just have to pick up a journal and be like, oh yeah, that is my handwriting, so I can tell that it is me, instead of, like, someone else. So usually at the beginning of our journals, we have a little entry where all of us, whoever is able to front and do that, of course, or wants to do that, we don't ever force anybody to do this, writes their name in their handwriting, which is pretty simple, just so they can look back and be like, oh yeah, okay, so I probably was fronting with this person and yada yada yada, just so they can figure it out. But for us, it's so strange how our handwriting is vastly different from one another. So that's usually the sign that when our handwriting changes, a switch has occurred.
That's very interesting. I find it so interesting when systems have very, like, concrete symptoms like that, or I don't even know if you'd call that a symptom, but I think that's very valid, and not every system has stuff like that, but I can see why that would be telling. For us, we all have, like, different favorite songs, like Bugs really likes rap music, but there are some alters who wouldn't be caught dead listening to rap.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would say we have different music tastes too, but it doesn't, like, trigger any switches for us, if that makes sense, because we don't listen to, like, specific music as in, like, per alter. They kind of mesh together. Like, we kind of all listen to each other's playlists and that kind of stuff, and we're like, oh, that song's cool, I'll add that to my playlist or something like that. But I find it really cool that people are able to just, based on music or, like, style, just be able to figure out that, like, oh, I'm this person based on that, because we just don't know each other super well. So we're just like, oh, but everybody in the system likes this song, if that makes sense. Like, it's not just me who likes this song, but then we realize that that other alters don't even listen to that type of song, because we're just like, because we're so self-centered as alters, and we don't see that, oh, I'm not the only one in the body, if that makes sense.
Right,
It's very much like, how do I say this properly? We don't realize that one another exists until the other, like, pops in and says, hey, don't do that, or in, like, co-front or something like that. We're very much, like, in our own worlds, even amongst alters when we're fronting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Do you think that connects to your NPD at all?
Honestly, I think it does, because the more and more I think about it, the more I'm like, yeah, I definitely think that does connect to our NPD, because it's just we're so self-centered about ourselves sometimes. And even among alters, other alters would be like, I'm better than everybody else in the system, actually. And other alters would be like, no, I'm literally better than everyone else in the system. And we'll find ourselves saying that and kind of arguing amongst each other, like, no, I'm better because I do this, no, I'm better because I do this. So I think that that's kind of how our NPD as a system shows up. and when interacting with other alters.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I also wanted to say something interesting that I have found with our NPD is that our empathy fluctuates, if that makes sense. We have very low empathy, but some alters don't have empathy at all, and they just are unable to we call it jump starting, like you're jump starting a car. Like some alters can jump start empathy for other alters, so they can be like, oh, I can see how that could affect another person, and maybe even think about it in that way. But other alters, like our alter calm, I say this because calm exhibits most of these symptoms, has zero empathy, is extremely apathetic, doesn't care about anything around them except themselves, and even sometimes when they're super bored, they don't care about themselves anyways, but they still have this grandiose idea of themselves. So it's very interesting how my empathy is vastly different from Calm's lack of empathy, even though my empathy is very low, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. That's very interesting.
Yeah, thought that you would find that interesting.
So this next one is a little bit of a loaded question. If you're not wanting to answer it, that's fine. But it is this. How do you personally find the balance between recognizing that it is not our fault what happened to us and how this affects us, how this presents, but that we are responsible for our actions and our healing process? An example that I have is I do allow myself to feel as much anger, sadness, etc. that I need to. I'm bursting with it sometimes, but the second that I use it as an excuse to lash out at people, I reassess what I'm doing and what I want to do.
Completely agree. I believe that what we lacked as a kid, we fully deserve now, to fully express ourselves and fully be ourselves, and especially emotions that you weren't allowed to feel as a kid, like such as a lot of us weren't allowed to feel sad, super angry, even super happy and other things like that. Like we deserved to express ourselves and be ourselves because we weren't allowed to when we were younger. But it does bridge a line between, if you're using it as an excuse to hurt other people, and this is something that we live by, even if you don't think that you hurt another person, even if you don't believe that your intentions were meant to harm somebody, if that person is hurt, then something has to be reassessed and something has to change. And that's kind of one of our morals that kind of guides us through everything because of our lack of our small amount of empathy, and because of our NPD symptoms and stuff like that, our potential NPD diagnosis. It's constantly something that has been guiding us throughout our lives, that just because I did not intend to hurt the other person does not mean that they weren't hurt, and does not mean that I can't reassess myself. I should, in those moments, reassess myself and really think, how did I accidentally or purposefully hurt this person? I often find times that because of our NPD, if we see somebody who we think is lower than us in the sense, or just not worth our time, we often treat them very differently than someone who we think is worth our time and that kind of stuff. But we have to constantly reassess ourselves and be like, hey, we can't treat a person lower just because our NPD is telling us that they are lower than us, if that makes sense. And I had a situation actually where an alter was very irritated. Their NPD was triggered. They just weren't feeling, they could not handle this person that we were friends with. And of course, my friend noticed this, felt really bad, and we really did not intend to hurt this person as much as as much as this alter was presenting, if that makes sense. They were just really irritated and having a bad day themselves. But that my friend came to us and said, hey, I was really hurt by what you said and that kind of stuff, and that I know you probably didn't intend this to be this way. And I of course said, we know we weren't intending to hurt you and that kind of stuff. But I had to reassess myself and say, like, stop giving excuses for hurting another person and just accept that you did and reassess what you need to do in the future to prevent that from happening again. And this was between two different alters. So the alter that did hurt had to apologize, as well as the alter that didn't hurt the person, if that makes sense. Just so we have system accountability. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but it was a very eye-opening moment for the system in terms of system recognition and system like acceptance of like letting the alters like really let themselves go in a way that's harmful versus in a way that's helpful. I hope that makes sense. I have no idea if that makes sense or not.
No, yeah, it made perfect sense. I think that is so great, the way that it was handled, and your moral, so to speak, of, you know, whether it was intentional or not, someone was hurt, whether even, like, we can even say this, even if, like, I hurt you and let's say I didn't do anything wrong but you were hurt, you're still hurt, and that's still something that needs to be assessed, whether it was realistically anything that, you know, is that making sense? Like, not...
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Like, say I accidentally made you feel that you were abandoned. It's not my intention, of course, to ever make you feel like you're abandoned, but because of certain disorders, especially your BPD, it can make you feel terrible and stuff like that. It's never my intention to make you feel that way. Just like with my NPD, it's never, I don't believe anybody's intention to make me feel like I am less worthy or less, that have make my ego any less or make me feel any type of way, but it still needs to be addressed because that's what healthy communication is. If you tell me, hey, when you did this, like say I didn't text back within like a day or two, and that just really gave you feelings of like maybe they're abandoning me and yada yada yada, that can be a boundary where I feel like, hey, like I need like a timely answer to my text messages, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that it is so important that what was I gonna say? I'm curious if you can relate to this with the NPD. With my BPD, something that I've really had to come to terms with is there are times that I split that literally no one did anything wrong. Like, there was this one time, I was splitting, and I'm very proud of myself because I did not make this anyone's problem, but I was splitting, and my fiance went to change the thermostat, and my brain said, I can't believe you would do that without asking me. And, like, that's not logical, you know, it's just a thermostat. But I remember being like, hey, I'm having thoughts right now. I don't think you did anything wrong, but I am feeling away. You know, how do we get through this? And I think that it's so important with, for me particularly with the BPD, it is important to recognize that while my feelings are always valid, they're not always logically sound.
That is exactly what I was trying to say. I'm so glad that you brought that up and explained it, because you explained it perfectly. But just because my NPD is triggered doesn't necessarily mean that it's logical that it's triggered, you know? Like, as oftentimes it's triggered by something that's completely irrelevant, that is not anything that would be harmful. Like, as you said, like turning on the thermostat isn't necessarily harmful, but you felt that way, you know? It's just because you were having a moment within your disorder. But I still think it's good to have those conversations and say like, hey, I was hurt by this. Is there anything that we can do, like when I'm in those moments, to at least make myself feel better so that we can have a healthier relationship? Because I'm trying to think of this one time where, okay, so my NPD is often triggered when people don't take my advice. Okay. Because I'm often like, how dare you not take my advice, because I'm obviously better and I know better than you, and because I'm a higher power, like I know everything, like I know how you should be handling the situation. In those moments, I have to take a step back and be like, hey, maybe instead of like giving advice, We can have moments where if you're not going to take the advice, where I can just listen to you vent, if that makes sense, and take a step back and just be like, this isn't something that's inherently harmful or anything, but it's the way I'm feeling behind it because of my disorder. If that makes sense, kind of similar to like your story about BPD. It's a different, of course, for narcissism, but it's just like, how do we compromise? How do we make this situation that is unavoidable, because I'm not going to force you to take my advice or not, because it's your life, but I would still like my advice to be heard and at least considered, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, and I think that's so great that you see it that way. Because I remember, just talking about me for a second, I remember when my BPD was untreated, I was unmedicated, and I also just wasn't trying. A big part of it was I didn't know I had BPD, but I wasn't trying to be a better person. And there were things that would trigger my BPD, and I wouldn't assess like my part of it. I would just be like, well, you're hurting me, you're wrong, you're bad. And now I'm such a big subscriber of meeting people where they're at both ways, because we can't control how we feel due to our disorders, but we're also not going to try to run anyone's life around ours, so compromise.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think, what's the term for it? My therapist says that we have very black and white thinking. And so I recognize that in you saying like, hey, this person's bad because they did this. It's not necessarily always black and white. Like, I'm not necessarily better because I have these traits, you know? It's trying to minimize that black and white thinking and meet in the gray area instead.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something I've been working on really hard over the last couple of years, and I think I've made a lot of progress.
Yeah, I think you, from what you've been saying, I think you've made a lot of progress.
Thank you. There's a couple more questions. If there was one thing you wish everyone could understand about mental illness as a whole, what would it be?
Okay, this is a tricky question because I have several points that I could make just about mental illness in general. But if over a whole is, I don't want these symptoms, if that makes sense. I never wanted to experience these symptoms, but these symptoms are uncontrollable for me. Especially with my potential NPD, especially with my DID. I cannot control that at all. That was just a trauma response that my brain learned in order to keep myself safe. And especially with like my OCD, my autism, none of that I chose.
Right.
I don't necessarily enjoy the symptoms, even though I can have good days with my symptoms, if that makes sense. And to me, it's important to know that I didn't choose to be this way, because a lot of people think like, just be happy, just be normal, just communicate more, just think of yourself as a normal human being, don't think of yourself greater than anybody else. But it's tricky because I didn't they make it seem like I'm choosing to be this way when I'm really not, and I am just experiencing and being myself the way I am and the way I was wired, and because of whether it's because of outside factors like trauma, or it's internal factors like that's how my brain was created, like with autism. So it's just like with mental illness as a whole, especially with just major depressive disorder, they did not choose to have that disorder. They did not choose to have their brain just chemically wired to do that to them. Just like nobody chooses to have diabetes, or any other sickness. Like, it's not a choice. So that's something that I think that a lot of people need to understand and learn, is that just because it's all in your head, it is all in my head because that's how my brain functions, and I didn't choose the brain that I was born with.
Right. And people who say, like, oh, it's all in your head about mental illness, they're forgetting the fact that your brain is, like, the whole point of your body.
Yeah. And, like, I think a lot of people don't realize that mental health and physical health are also related.
Oh,
so
yeah.
When I have, like, a bad gut day, am like, oh, am I having a bad mental health day? Is that makes sense? Like they're sometimes they go hand in hand. So when people say, oh, it's all in your head, I'm like, yeah, it's all in my head, and my head affects every single part of me. So yeah.
Okay, so what terms have you found in terms of DID helpful in describing alter roles, such as your term bodyguard? And if you feel like it, feel free to explain what the bodyguard term is.
I found that the bodyguard term is helpful for a lot of our alters, because sometimes so the term bodyguard we created just to say that they're an alter that protects like one specific alter, almost like a bodyguard. They really care about that alter, they really care for that alter, they protect that alter almost to a point of like overprotection, especially with our alter Vivi and our alter Ava. Vivi protects Ava even when she doesn't need to be protected. So that's a term that we found to be really helpful, because it describes so much more than just being a protector. It's more of a specific protector, if that makes sense. So we like coming up with terms that are specific to us, that kind of describe our experiences more, and also in words that are simple, so that another person can like catch on quickly that that's what we meant. So that's kind of how we think of roles and terms, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
We of course go with like the normal roles, like of course like the protectors, the caretakers, the persecutors, just to name like a couple in the protective round, the protective realm. But I'm also making up our own terms like bodyguard and stuff like that, just to really show our experiences as we experience them. Because I understand that DID is way under researched, and there's not just like say like 10 roles. There's obviously a bunch more than that, especially when you are polyfragmented.
Oh yeah.
Because the alters have even more specific jobs. Like we have an alter that's specifically an alarm clock. Like gets us up in the morning, and it's just like, hey, it's time to wake up. Like we can literally tell this alter, hey, I need to wake up at 5 a.m. They will wake us up at 5 a.m. on the dot. Like that's their specific job.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like there's way more roles than just the generic ones. Even if you are like, let's say like the protector, and then like has a little diagram, and like it's like persecutor, caretaker, bodyguard, or other protective roles. There's like, they can be like generalized, or they can be like really specific parts of those generalizations, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it really depends on what the alter themselves needs to be labeled as. I have alters who don't even care about labels, and I think that's very valid as well. You know, some alters we have just do what they do.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we have many alters who just prefer to be unlabeled. Like, we could label them if we really wanted to, but since they don't want to be labeled, like, why would you force that on them?
Oh, yeah.
Like, just let them be themselves in the way that they think of themselves, if that makes sense. If they want to be labeled in the future, they can. Even if they are labeled now and are like, oh, I don't agree with that label anymore, they're totally allowed to feel as if their role has changed, or if they've just gotten rid of their role. We used to have an apparently normal part named Melody, and they were like, I once they figured out some trauma, they were like, I can't be an apparently normal part anymore. I really can't fulfill that role anymore. I feel like I've changed. And now they've changed their role to a trauma holder instead. So it's very interesting how you bring that up, because yes, you can be unlabeled, and yes, your roles can change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious. I wonder, like, if the stars ever aligned, if Melody and Sunny would want to talk at some point, because I bet they could really relate to each other. She used to be a mood booster alter, and she is just not anymore. She's honestly, like, pretty, like, a sadness holder. And that was really difficult for her to make that change and to accept that change, because a lot of it happened very naturally for her, and then she just had to stop pretending.
Oh yeah, I feel like Melody would really relate to that because I read some of their notes about how they feel about being because they started to make an alter roll call post but just
Mm-hmm.
haven't posted it yet. Um, so they really honestly they talk about all the time like I really just want to go back to like they used to be a big partier and stuff like that. They
Mm-hmm.
really want to go back to like their normal self. But they can't keep forcing them to go back to the way they were before they recognized having trauma, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what do you do to take care of yourself during or after an especially symptomatic day?
Okay, so a lot of the things that we do, we actually do before we have a symptomatic day. So we do it in preparation for, like, we practice,
Mm-hmm.
first of all, coping mechanisms on a day that we feel really good, just so we can remember the coping mechanisms when we're feeling really bad. So we have those good habits in place. So that's kind of what we do beforehand. But during a crisis, oh boy,
Mm-hmm.
there we try everything. We kind of have levels to it. So like saying that we're having like a green day instead of a yellow day or a red day. A green day would be like all of our coping mechanisms work. We can be more chill about our coping mechanisms. They don't have to be as rigorous. We don't have to use more of the protective coping mechanisms, if that makes sense. But if we're
Mm-hmm.
having a yellow day, it's more intense coping mechanisms, more like stay away from certain places, coping mechanisms day, like even leaving certain environments. And then when we're in the red zone, it's like constantly being by people and stuff like that, just those protective factors, just so we don't get into like above red range, which is like I guess
Mm-hmm.
pink, um, is just preventing those tipping points of crisis where we have to go to the hospital or we have to go inpatient.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the white area where we practice our coping mechanisms on a really good day, the green area where all of our coping mechanisms work, the yellow area where some of our coping mechanisms don't work, they have to use more severe ones, the red having to use our protective factors like reasons for living, just staying in that staying up before we get to the pink area where we have to leave our environment and go to an inherently safe space, which is debatable whether the hospital is safe or not, but
Mm-hmm.
it's safer than being on our own. So we have to go to the hospital when we get to that pink range. And it's very you have to recognize where you are in levels. Like I would say today, we woke up probably in a yellow range, but now we're moving closer to a green range, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of assessing where you are when you wake up, just so you know like how the day is going to go, if that makes sense. It's like we could have a red day today. I have no clue, but I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
prepare in case we have a red day, and by doing those coping mechanisms when I'm in that green area or even in the white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great. It's something that sucks but is good to know is that like especially with certain people, mental illness can like really take a turn very quickly. So doing those
Mm-hmm.
preventative measures is very smart.
Yes, yes. We find that we have to do the preventative measures constantly because
Mm-hmm.
otherwise we dip so far into having to go into that crisis range and having to go to the hospital. I think we went to the mental hospital 5 times last year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we can just so easily just tank. So it's
Yeah.
really those preventative measures that keep us from going to the hospital.
Mm-hmm. And that's very important. I don't think that like I don't want to talk about this too much because the psych hospital situation is so complicated and it's particular to
Mm-hmm.
people's own experiences. But at the end of the day, I think if the psych hospital you're going to is safe and does care about you and is good, I think that it is very important to allow yourself to use that help.
I completely agree. I am a big advocate for that going to the hospital or getting that help from people or professionals is mental health advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
That is advocating for yourself and doing something good for yourself. I'm very lucky and very fortunate that I have been a part of this mental health hospital for my close to my entire life. I have been
Mm-hmm.
working with them for, I want to say, upwards of 10 to 11 years now, with my mental health journey. So I can say confidently that I feel comfortable going there when I'm in those stressful times. But of course, it's not the same for everybody, and I understand how privileged I am to have that kind of situation with this specific mental hospital. But if you do have the resources, I would implore you to use them and to make sure that you are safe, because there is no shame in using those resources. No matter how many times you have to use those resources, there is no shame at all, because you are keeping yourself safe, you're keeping yourself alive, you are doing everything in your power to not, I don't want to say fight back against the mental illness, but to take care of those symptoms of your mental illness.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it.
Thank you.
All right, so there are just 2 questions left. Who are some ultras you think are doing a really great job right now working on the healing process? Who do you think could use like a shout out or like an uplift?
Okay, so this is very interesting. I like this question a lot. So I really want to shout out Angel, our therapist. Apparently, I don't remember this therapy session at all, but apparently 2 therapy sessions ago, Angel came forward about having like this moral superiority and feeling like a higher power to our therapist. And our therapist said like, hey, just because you have a talent for helping people doesn't mean that you are morally superior than they are, and does not mean that you're a higher power. It just means that you have a talent in that area. And that's a hard-hitting thing for Angel to hear. Like, she fully believes everything about herself is holy and that kind of stuff. But it was very hard for her to hear, but despite hearing it, she's really taking it to heart. And she's trying so hard to change and to not try to feel morally superior to other people. And that's going to take a long time, because it's one of her core beliefs, like it's a core part of her personality. But she's working and taking steps already to be more, I don't want to say normal, because that's not the right word.
Right.
But be more accepting of who she really is.
Yeah, that's so fantastic. I'm so proud of her.
Yeah, me too.
All right, so last question. What are some, if you can think of any at this moment, concrete steps you can take in your own healing journey, either as yourself or as a collective?
So one of the things that I am working towards is getting into a residential program for mental health, which is just like normally a 6 to 8 week program where they do specific therapies and that kind of stuff. I don't want to say this the institute's name just for privacy purposes and that kind of stuff, but I'm currently trying to get into residential for that. And I think that once I do get into residential for that program, that it's going to be immensely helpful in just my my ability to deal with dissociation and ability to deal and to have all these coping mechanisms at my service, because I'll be in a safe space for 6 to 8 weeks and constantly working on it in therapy and that kind of stuff. And that's enough time, I think, to really get things down and to really get things in a place where I want them. So that's something that I think, it's a big step, but I think it's something that I can do hopefully this year.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm so excited for you. I hope that goes well.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you would like to say before we wrap up?
I guess thank you for listening to me, and thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I hope that if you are listening or watching this at home or wherever you are, that you take your mental health seriously, because you deserve to have your mental health taken just as seriously and with love and acceptance as well. I hope that you can be mindful of your experiences and really delve into your experiences in a way that's healthy, of course. I just want you to feel that you're not alone in this journey. If there's anything that I have learned from running a mental health Instagram, from talking to other people with mental health issues and that kind of stuff, is that no experience is completely unique. there are, like, of course, things that are going to be different in each experience because no one has the perfectly same experience, but you're never alone in a certain area of life. Like, there's so many different people and there's so many different experiences out there. You just have to be open and willing to hear them.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I had a great time. I learned some really interesting things, and thank you for joining me.
Yeah, no problem. Take care.
You too. And I will say goodbye to the video as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.